What did you set out to achieve here on Melliodora?
Well, firstly, coming to Melliodora, we wanted somewhere to be self-reliant, as was reasonably appropriate to the site and the situation without being obsessed with self-sufficiency. We also wanted the place to be an example of my work as a permaculture designer, because that was my primary livelihood when we came here. It seemed that 2¼ acres was a small, modest project, at least to me, at the age of 30. And that was time to be able to devote to larger projects in the community, other developments which have happened and taken a lot of our energy.
So in all your years working in permaculture, how do you break the definition to someone who doesn't know what permaculture is or who knows a little bit on the edge?
Yeah, permaculture has sort of infused through the whole popular culture in Australia more than anywhere else. Even though permaculture in a total sense of global activism, what's here in Australia is now a tiny fraction of the world. But it's had the longest history and interthreaded to lots of people in lots of different ways of life. And everyone has, a lot of people have a sense of what it is as maybe a cool form of organic gardening or self-reliant living or various different takes on it. Of course, it's actually a design system for sustainable land use and sustainable living. So it's concerned with both the consumption side and the production side of the equation. So, you know, it actually connects to everything, but different people have sort of starting points and for a lot of those, it's gardening. Of course, a lot of permaculture activists have said that permaculture is actually revolution disguised as gardening. That's not a sort of a concrete intent, but obviously the adoption of the whole systems view, rearranging society, is actually revolutionary, at least in terms of society's sustainability.
So there's rows of revolution in them there garden beds behind you.
Well, to grow your own food is to, what the economists would say, this horrible term, disintermediate the whole industrial food production chain and bring it back to a household economy. That's actually good for the environment, it's good for society, it's good for health, to bring a lot of those things that we've outsourced to the monetary economy, bring them back home. But of course, as more people do that, the household and community economies, non-monetary economies, will grow and the GDP will go down. And of course, that is treason.
Part of what you talk about in terms of future change is, you know, making more community on existing spaces. Melliodora is now an example of growing community on an existing space. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Here at Melliodora, we started off on 2¼ acres with a single household. We planned there to be 2 houses. We thought it was a bit unrealistic to keep 2¼ acres that's zoned for residential development as pure horticultural land. So partly as a hedge against rising rates that would push you out, and partly in terms of sharing the beautiful and productive place and that it needs more people to work it. The optimum, if you like, property extended household economy is much more than a single family, and certainly much more than just a couple. So we've done that over the years with volunteers, interns, and then of course our home-based business has people working here, they all eat here. So there's been ways in which Melliodora is home on at least a temporary basis to many more people. But in more recent years, following building a house for the second house on the property for my mother to live in her last years, we knew that was a stepping stone to more permanent residents here. So we now have 3 semi-autonomous households sharing this 2¼ acres. And yeah, we're starting to approach, if you like, the densities of suburbia in that way. But it's like the internal property economy that's happening, so community within the wider community.
So it can work.
Well, of course, these challenges of how we share what we have in affluent Australian society is probably the biggest challenge of all, but it's the biggest opportunity to actually achieve more, lower our ecological footprint, and really have more fun.
So you've created a system that's scalable. What do you say to people who are living in ever reduced size blocks, small apartments, they've got balconies, they've got rooftops, they've got small courtyards? What do you say to them about how they can connect and integrate what you're talking about?
Yeah, the whole issue of scale in permaculture, there's very different techniques and strategies that are relevant to different scales. And that's very clear in gardening. If you're gardening on 5 square metres, it's very different techniques to 50 square metres or 5,000 square metres. And similarly with permaculture, when we came here, for me as the co-originator of permaculture, to move to a place in a suburban street with 2¼ acres was going very micro compared with the big broad acre vision. So a lot of what we've done here is relevant to small rural properties, but it's also relevant back into suburbia. How much of it's relevant back into the apartment living is obviously becomes more challenging, but of course the underlying ethics and principles apply everywhere. And when you have less and less private space, then that means more of what you need to be doing is in the common spaces. And so whether that's being part of a community garden project, being part of a community supported agriculture where you're buying food from a local organic farmer, connecting into things that complement still what you can do in your household. Because even in that micro level, there's still things that can be done where we can do more things for ourselves, whether it's fermenting food, fixing things at home, many things that are all part of that greater self-reliance, greater resilience, and lower ecological footprint.
Would you say, after all this time and everything you've looked at from the big picture right down to the micro, would you say that the suburbs are really the place where the greatest change can happen in the present and immediate future?
The suburbs are the sweet point for this bottom-up, household-led change. There's no doubt about that, and for a number of reasons. Firstly, most Australians live in suburbia, and by suburbia I don't just mean the vast tracts of residential landscapes around our capital cities. I almost also mean rural and regional towns, and right down to villages like Hepburn Springs where we live. So that's really important, because we're not going to wave the magic wand and say we're going to design new sustainable communities for the climate changed, radically different futures that we're facing. There's not time to do that. We're actually going to adapt in situ, by hook or by crook. So if you like, that's the sobering message. But the positive message is that suburbia has that sweet point between the capacity to be self-reliant that we associate with rural areas and the connection and collective capacity that we associate with cities. And I think it's that sweet edge between those.
What's the simplest entry point for people to start to exercise self-reliance and resilience in their day-to-day lives?
To become more resilient and self-reliant, it's often really good to do a personal and household audit. what's coming in, what's going out. And that sort of rational approach can be quite challenging because it can show, oh, we have a very high debt level and that is actually driving everything we do, and that is undermining our efforts. For other people, they just need to get out and plant some seeds in the garden and get that positive feedback that will sort of get them focused on what's the good things that I want to somehow work out how to do more of, and what are the things I want to be doing less of. So, you know, you can start with the easy, simple things and something that's a bright spark, or you can do the stand back and let's look at our situation. Because often those underlying structural things, like debt, like long distance commuting, like habits of consumption, of needs that have turned into wants, and vice versa, all of that sprawling mess are inhibiting our ability to do those things.
What's so special about sitting down to meals that have come from the garden?
When we first came here to grow your own food, have sometimes a whole meal that was just from the garden, was incredibly special. But over time, over 3 decades, it becomes sort of normal, and you could say not special at all. But the way we keep that special is by that seasonality, that we don't buy things out of season. We just have what we produce. And obviously with grains and various other things that we don't produce, we buy them. But the seasonal fluctuation of vegetables, fruits, and even in relation to the abundance or not of dairy products is pulsed with the season, and that makes it special every time.
What's nature taught you after all this time? And
Well, I suppose I've had a lot of lessons around thinking you can design everything, find all the facts, select all the right varieties, get all the relationships, and sometimes nature is adding other species, is giving you feedback that no, what you've done doesn't really work, and constantly looking at the wild, what happens by itself as a source of learning, and that may be the model of the more sophisticated, deep permaculture design, rather than the package of ideas we've got from reading books and making all our own decisions. So nature is constantly giving you feedback.
so 30 years down the track, what sort of results have you achieved, and are you happy?
Well, we've become more self-sufficient than we sort of really perhaps originally intended. The place being an example of my work as a permaculture designer has morphed into regular tours and courses and media events that have taken permaculture to the world. So it's contributed to that larger sense rather than just client consultants seeing that, yes, I do what I'm talking about type of idea. And, you know, for us, it's been a building of deeper resilience and deeper connection in the community. You know, there's also been some things about gardening. You know, when you're gardening on the same soil, 30 years, summer and winter, producing food, there's all sorts of things with diseases and stuff that pop up that you often think of mature gardens as being, you know, just getting better and better and better. And in some ways they do. And in other areas you go, gee, wouldn't it be good to have a fresh site? You know, so those histories of things done, mistakes made that sometimes take years to sort of work around. And the challenges of wildlife, the challenges of climate, of a drying climate, we pretty much were expecting that. So, but it still is a shock, like this season, to be putting out water at a rate we never have in 30 years because of the constant heat. So it's a mixed, mostly positive story, I think.
Succession's something that we tend to not do very well at all, isn't it?
Succession, especially amongst radical individualist environmental thinkers and actors, is enormously difficult, on top of the general difficulty in Australian society that we all like to do things the way we like to do them. Learning to navigate those changes that are in fact, inevitably coming to all of us as we age is a really important pathway forward, and very important in terms of the widening gulf in equity between young people who don't have access to property and older people who happen to own property just because of the chances of the history of property bubbles and other dynamics that are nothing to do with our hard work or what we did sensibly. So those issues are obviously very touchy, hot button issues, and I don't think there's any easy answers, but they're very central to the thinking amongst many permaculture pioneers about how does their work continue in some way. Melliodora, of course, is only one example of permaculture ethics and principles applied in a cool climate, in regional Australia, with particular people. But it involves the built environment, passive solar design, all of the aspects of the physical way the property is set up, the irrigation systems, all the infrastructure, the biological in the gardens, the animals, and also in the behavioural of how we organise and live to minimise our dependence on the monetary economy. Of course, we are part of the monetary economy, but at quite a low level, and provide more of our needs at the household level directly. That builds resilience to future shock, it lowers ecological footprint, and it makes us more empowered and in control of our lives. So it draws together a lot of different elements, but of course it's just one particular example.